Committee will come to order. Good afternoon and thank you. Thank you all for being here today. We are continuing our work to advance the people's priorities through an open, inclusive legislative process. We're picking up where we left off in last week's markup, and with the consideration of 4 tax bills that solve challenges related to energy production, student loans, and access to water. First up is H.R. 5897, bipartisan legislation, authored by Congressman Rice and Blumenauer. This bill will ensure the effective operation of the tax credit for nuclear energy production. Next, we have another bipartisan bill by Congresswoman Noem, helping ensure accountability, leadership, and transparency in Tribal Health Care Act. Congresswoman Noem's bill offers comprehensive reforms to improve health care in Indian country. This includes the provision under our committee's jurisdiction to help medical professionals in the Indian Health Service who receive assistance with their student loans. The provision ensures they receive the same tax treatment as is provided for medical professionals in the National Health Service. Third, we'll consider the Stop Taxing Death and Disability Act, bipartisan legislation championed by Congressman Roscom in kind. This bill will protect families from being hit with a large tax bill when federal student loans are forgiven due to death or disability. Finally, we have a bill authored, if everyone will take their seats. Finally, we have a bill authored by Congressman Ken Buck that addresses tax-exempt organizations organized to help with the efficient allocation of water resources. This important legislation takes action to improve access to water in drought-stricken areas of the country. As I've said before, our committee is dedicated to taking action wherever possible to advance innovative solutions that will help American people. And today, we have several bipartisan solutions before us that have strong support on both sides of the aisle. But I hope we can pass these bills with strong bipartisan support, just like the legislation we passed last week. Again, I want to thank everyone for being here today, and I want to thank all the members who've crafted the bills before us for your hard work, leadership, and commitment to delivering solutions for the American people. This time I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Levin, for any opening comments he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. These 4 bills are relatively modest in their scope and in their cost and in terms of how controversial they are. But I want to take this opportunity to comment on 3 characteristics relating to how the Republican majority here in this committee are proceeding. First of all, there's been no action on any of the additional bills that we proposed. We sent them to you, 10 days ago? And so far, all we've been told is we're thinking about it. And this lack of meaningful bipartisanship, I think, is a mistaken step in terms of how we're going to proceed in the future, whoever is in the majority here, especially as to tax reform. So I think, number one, a characteristic that's worrisome is the lack of really effective bipartisanship. The second I want to comment on is the failure so far to correct mistakes that were made in the energy bills. 48C, those mistakes should have been corrected. We've all admitted that they were not effectively put into legislative form in the final version. We've had assurances from the majority in the Senate and really references here in the majority in the House that there would be action taken, but it never happens. And so here we are the last few days before we recess, and there's been no action on these important items. And the third point I want to mention, I think there's been basically an insensitivity here as to what really matters. We marked up the last time 5719, It costs over $1 billion. It relates to stock options. And there's some merit to taking up that bill. It does refer to the business community. It does address what could be a problem, especially in terms of smaller operations. But here we are again, just a few days away, and there, I guess, is the notion we'll take up that bill unpaid for, $1 billion tomorrow, and there has not been any action on the needs in Flint, Michigan. Just 1/10 of the $1 billion would be a major step forward in terms of addressing the breakdown of the system, the water structure in Flint that has led to the poisoning of many, many people, including young children. And I want to finish with another example of, I think, the insensitivity and the mistaken path, and that relates to Zika. Again, here we are a few days from leaving, and there is no assurance that action is going to be taken on the Zika virus. That $1 billion that may come up tomorrow unpaid for would go a long way towards addressing a health problem that is truly an emergency. Just listen to the leadership in this country as to the work on a vaccine, as to the work on other endeavors that need to be addressed to address this Zika problem. And here we are passing tax bills unpaid for, and in one case costing over $1 billion. So again, these are three characteristics of how we're proceeding that I think are woefully wrong, and I think send the wrong signals and the wrong realities to the people of this country. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. Our first order of business is H.R. 5879 to amend the Internal Revenue Code 1986 to modify the credit for production from advanced nuclear power facilities. This time I'd like to recognize the bill's sponsor, Mr. Rice, for an opening statement.
Chairman Brady, thank you for scheduling today's markup. I'd also like to thank my friend across the aisle, Congressman Blumenauer, for his support on this legislation. 11 years ago, Congress included the nuclear production tax credit as part of its comprehensive energy effort, the Energy Policy Act of 2005. As the last domestic nuclear power reactor was built decades ago, Congress designed the nuclear PTC, specifically Section 45J, to encourage investment in advanced, passive, safe nuclear energy. South Carolina and Georgia heard this call loud and clear and began working on an innovative design for nuclear power in the United States. In these states, the first nuclear plants to be built in more than 30 years are under construction. The construction for any first-of-kind power plant involves additional expense and risk. These 4 advanced nuclear units represent an investment of such a scale that they require joint development by both public and private entities. In each unit, one of the partners is a not-for-profit entity, either a municipal public power authority or an electric cooperative and a municipal power authority. According to current guidance from the Department of Treasury, the allocation of the PTCs to these facilities results in tax credits allocated on a pro rata ownership basis to the municipal or cooperative owner. The problem with this allocation is that these not-for-profit entities cannot utilize the credits and cannot pass the full benefits on to their customers. Clearly, the Department of Treasury's interpretation creates inequities among project stakeholders that must be corrected for the program to work as Congress originally intended. The legislation Mr. Blumenauer and I propose would correct this oversight and allow recipients to more efficiently utilize the credits by allowing the allocation of the credits among owners and project partners by agreement. This change would assure that there are not two classes of advanced nuclear power customers and instead assure parity among the beneficiaries of this program. In addition, this bill ensures that the 6,000 megawatt capacity authorized by Congress in 2005 is fulfilled as intended and stops there. This is not an expansion of the program. When Congress passed the 2005 Act, it could not have contemplated the effort it would take to get a nuclear plant designed and licensed. In South Carolina, one of the first projects to start this process, it took almost 7 years just to get a license to begin construction. To ensure the nuclear production tax credit operates as designed to encourage investment in nuclear energy, this legislation also provides a first-in mechanism if it is not fully subscribed by 2020. Currently, the Department of Treasury assumes the program will be fully subscribed, but it is appropriate to include a process should the program not be fully utilized at the end of 2020. Converting the existing allocation system to a first-in-service program would provide a simple economic incentive to get developers of new nuclear moving quickly. I look forward to working with every member of the committee to advance this critical legislation. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rice. At this time, I recognize Ranking Member Levin or his designee for an opening statement.
My pleasure to you, to Mr. Blumenauer.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. I appreciate the comments from my friend from South Carolina outlining the thrust of this legislation. It's not an expansion, it's a refinement to allow it to work. There are multiple benefits for this. I have watched the emergence of this company for some 20 years. It was the genesis in Corvallis, Oregon. Some people who had a vision about small-scale nuclear on a modular basis, a design that would be safer, quicker, ultimately cheaper. In fact, Secretary Moniz just a week ago, before the Committee on Appropriations for the Energy and Water Department, referred to this type of small-scale nuclear activity. The tax code, as my friend from South Carolina pointed out, has really not used the existing production tax credit after 10 years. The bill will make small adjustments so that the new generation of these smaller, safer, modular reactors can come online. And the cooling mechanism avoids some of the problems, for example, like Fukushima, because power interrupting does not make it impossible to have the cooling kick in should it be necessary. I've watched the researchers at Oregon State University develop this passive safety system that uses natural circulation to provide cooling. I think it's a major advance in nuclear safety. The smaller, safer, modular alternative, as referenced in the Secretary's testimony, can be used to replace some of the retired coal plants, for example, in the Utah Municipal Power System. I hope, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Levin, that we can continue down this path to make some progress on our renewable energy future. The renewable provisions that were sort of left behind last December, I hope we can revisit some of those. There's a lot of interest, I think, on a bipartisan basis on the committee. We're looking at emerging technologies. I think this is innovative, but we also have offshore wind, wave action. There are a number of items that could generate economic activity, generate energy, and I think would be small but not insignificant advancements that the committee could take credit for. I appreciate the opportunity to have the committee consider this. It's part of our future to see if we can make nuclear energy work in a way that's safe and effective and manageable. Making this production credit work with this technology, I think, is an important step in that direction. I appreciate the committee's consideration and hope that we can act on it quickly and allow this to move forward. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Blumenauer. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 5879. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. At this time, I'll offer an amendment in the nature of substitute, which was distributed in advance, along with the green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, considered base text for purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Tom Barthold, the Chief of Staff for the Joint Committee on Taxation, provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. Ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Barthold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, you have before you two joint committee documents, JCX 76 and 77, which describe H.R. 5879 and the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. The underlying legislation, as noted, modifies the nuclear production tax credit. That tax credit is an allocated credit, and the nature of the modifications are two. One, it allows for a reallocation of initial unutilized credit allocations, and two, it would allow public entities to forego their share of credit that they would otherwise be eligible for in a project in favor of designated eligible partners also involved in the same project. The chairman's amendment modifies the effective date so that it applies to transfer of credits for years beginning after 2016. That concludes my brief description of the legislation as amended. Happy to answer any questions that the members might have.
Thank you. Are there any questions about the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Jim?
Mr. McDermott, Dr. McDermott.
I only have the question, in Washington State, we have been involved in nuclear power for a long time, going back to the creation of the atomic bomb at Hanford. The problem has always been what to do with the waste. And I wonder, is there anything in this amendment that allows the companies to avoid the responsibility for the waste, or anything that talks about what's going to happen to the waste in terms, or is that just is silent on that issue?
Mr. McDermott, the legislation before you as amended makes no change to present law with regards to waste disposal. It only relates to the production tax credit itself.
Does it do anything with the responsibility?
Makes no change in any other aspect of the nuclear energy industry.
It's simply some
within,
credits can
within
go
the
from
jurisdiction
here to
of
there.
this committee, which is the tax treatment, and in this case, it's the particular tax benefit provided by the production tax credit.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions about the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Mr. Meehan, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank Mr. Rice for introducing the legislation which will contribute to this all-of-the-above energy approach. Ensuring we continue to enjoy a diversified energy portfolio is something that I know is important to members on both sides of the aisle. Nuclear energy is an important resource in my home state of Pennsylvania's energy mix. It accounts for 35% of our electricity, in addition to contributing $2.4 billion to Pennsylvania's economy. Laying the foundation for advanced nuclear technology has always been important in Pennsylvania, but as we face the issue of premature nuclear plant closures confronted by a growing number of states, I expect we'll be called upon to do more to preserve these facilities and their many contributions in our nation's energy mix. Secondly, I'd like to echo the remarks of my colleague Tom Reed. We all know the dynamics surrounding Section 48 technologies, and the drafting are in the omnibus at the end of 2015, excluding fuel cells, combined heat and power systems, and microturbines, and the extension of Section 48 investment tax credit. This issue isn't without political sensitivity. I appreciate that. From where I sit, the political differences should be put aside On the merits, in terms of jobs created and reliability, I'm more convinced than ever that we need to fix this discrepancy, and we need to do it soon. It's jobs, it's technologies that are almost exclusively managed in the United States, and it's reliability, where the power to customers is independent of weather conditions. So these technologies have transitioned from development to commercialization and play a vital role in ensuring that all of our constituents enjoy reliable, resilient, and affordable energy. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Pascal, you're recognized to strike the last word. Great, thank you. We will move to that next. Dr. Price, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too want to thank Mr. Rice and Mr. Blumenauer for offering this piece of legislation. I support it strongly. It would clearly, that would modify the credit from advanced nuclear power facilities. Nuclear power tax credit is working as Congress had intended it to. It's been successful in encouraging the development of some new nuclear capacity, but the credit can be improved, and this legislation does just that. Simply makes the benefits of the program more efficient and ensures that those benefits will flow directly to the people and the customers of the companies taking the risk to invest in nuclear power. This legislation is particularly important in the nation's southeast area, and particularly in my state, my home state of Georgia, which has seen close to $14 billion of investment in nuclear power, and nuclear power will soon have provide 20% of the electricity for our entire state. So I want to commend once again Mr. Rice, Mr. Blumenauer for introducing this legislation. I strongly support it and yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Blumenauer, did you wish to strike the last word? No. Mr. Reed, you're recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to offer two comments. First, I'd like to thank my colleagues, Mr. Rice and Mr. Blumenauer, for offering this proposed legislation. And in regards to this legislation, I do want to make just a comment about existing prior to 1994 nuclear facilities, as we've had some of these facilities in our state of New York. I think recognizing the need for those facilities to potentially be recognized or in the future for a potential tax incentive to make sure that those facilities are maintained, improved, and brought up to new standards. But echoing the comments of my good friend from Pennsylvania, Mr. Meehan, I am very interested in working with our colleagues, as has been indicated by our bill, H.R. 5167, the Technologies for Energy Security Act, which many members on this committee have joined us in supporting. This extends the investment tax credit under Section 48 for things like geothermal, fuel cells, small wind, and combined heat and power, and will help create jobs, diversify our nation's energy portfolio, and help support energy security. I look forward to joining with my colleague, Mr. Meehan, not only to support those credits that were involved in the situation at the end of last year, as well as my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, as well as potentially having a strong debate about expanding the investment tax credit to those alternative and renewable technologies that I am very supportive of for the reasons cited. With that, I yield back.
Well, thank you, Mr. Reed. Dr. McDermott, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, as I said earlier, the state of Washington has been involved with nuclear power for a very long time. And we once had a governor who said that we should bring all the nuclear waste in the world to the Hanford Reservation in the middle of our state. She was defeated at the next election. The problem is that everyone here is talking positively about nuclear power, and there's no reason to be negative about nuclear power per se. But what does not get considered here is the disposal of waste. The Hanford Cleanup Project has been underway and has not been well funded over the course of 40 years. And the problem you have is you've got a bipartisan effort in this Congress to prevent anybody from having nuclear waste in their backyard. The Yucca plant, or the Yucca Mountain facility, has been sitting there, and we never move on it. And the question you have to face at some point is, what are you going to do with the nuclear waste? Now, our problem in the state of Washington is sitting out there in rusting tanks and leaking into the ground in an agricultural state next to a major river that has salmon in it, and a wine industry all over the place, and apples, and a whole bunch of agricultural things. that could easily be affected by leakage into the Columbia River or tributaries. And one of the things that does not get, I think, I'm not going to be here, but you all have to recognize that when you're expanding nuclear power, you're creating more waste. And at some point, that bill's going to come due in some problem. Now, 3 Mile Island, we've sort of all forgotten that, and some other things that have happened in this country, and we certainly forgotten Chernobyl. All these were, those are old plants. We got better plants. They're safer plants now. I know. I understand science and how you move forward. But the fact is that there has to be some attention paid to how you deal with nuclear waste. Because whatever the problems are that you get, we're still paying for downwinders, who were people who lived downwind from the nuclear power plants when they were being constructed back in the 40s and 50s. And when you don't think about that, you are creating a problem for yourself. And one of the problems with this tax credit, we're pushing forward, but we're not dealing with the nuclear waste issue. That issue is not being dealt with in the Congress. And I don't see the advantage. I mean, it's interesting to hear people who don't like this whole idea of global warming and that we have to shift from fossil fuels now come out here and say how wonderful this nuclear power is because it's going to replace fossil fuels. It must be seeping into their consciousness there's some change. But the fact is that nuclear power is not without its downside. And everybody should recognize it when you're voting on this. I personally intend to vote no on it because I know I've been 40 or 50 years involved in nuclear waste issue in the state of Washington, and it's not resolved yet, and it isn't resolved any place in this country, and that's why they're closing plants, because American people, citizens, are saying, we don't want that. And so you're going to have all kinds of problems. The problems of getting plants approved is not because the science of technology of a plant is not there. It's the public acceptance of the nuclear fuel plants as a way of producing energy. And that's going to go on. We can change the law here, and maybe it'll make for a couple of plants somewhere, I don't know. But it's not going to solve the problem of our energy until we deal with the waste. I yield back the balance.
Thank you. Mr. Lewis, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I would like to strike the last word. I would like to thank the ranking member and the committee staff for working so hard to make the case for good Democratic-led bills to be considered by this committee. I must say that I'm disappointed that my bill, the Siegel AmeriCorps Education Award Tax Relief Act, is not being considered, not been marked up today. But I do hope that it will be considered by the full committee in the near future. My bill, H.R. 4949, would exclude the education award from gross income and reaffirm congressional support for those who voluntarily choose to devote a year of their life to service. This is a prime example of the good, polished, common sense Democratic bill which are not being considered by this committee. Few here may realize that AmeriCorps has engaged 1 million Americans in community service in every state for over 20 years. Every single AmeriCorps member completes a term of service, receive an education award that may be used toward a future degree or to pay off existing qualified student loan. The value of the award is linked to a Maxim Pell Grant. The American Corps Education Award is treated differently than other fellowship, scholarships, and education award program designed with a similar purpose of Pell Grants, the GI Bill, the National Health Service Corps. The American Corps Education Award is subject to federal taxation after it is used. According to CRS, it can be taxed at a rate of 15%, and it can move American Corps alumni into a higher tax bracket. The award is held in a trust until it is paid directly to the lender of the college or university, so there's no opportunity to convert a portion into cash to pay the resulting taxes. The financial hardship created by the tax discouraged use of the award and delay educational plan. For low-income youth, the tax is making AmeriCorps service a less viable option. The AmeriCorps Education Award Tax Relief Act has been introduced in many Congresses and received bipartisan support. In 11 Congress, this bill has 67 co-sponsors, including 16 members of the House Ways and Means Committee. In fact, Senator Hatch has sponsored the bill in the Senate called the Service Act legislation, which would have provided similar tax relief to AmeriCorps members. AmeriCorps provide a critical source of human capital to meet pressing community needs access in this country. AmeriCorps members tutor children who are struggling in school, respond to natural disasters, build homes for low-income families, help veterans, preserve the environment, and so much more. In addition, AmeriCorps provides a pathway to economic and educational opportunity for those who serve. The AmeriCorps Education Award should continue to be a viable and compelling incentive for young people to serve our country. And Mr. Chairman, it is my hope that one day very soon we will consider this legislation. Thank you, and I'll yield back.
No, thank you, Mr. Lewis. Mr. Thompson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad we're taking up issues dealing with energy, but I'm a little concerned that we're not taking up the right bills dealing with energy. Mr. McDermott talked about the downside of nuclear energy bills, and I think he's spot on that. But there are some efforts by members of this committee to deal with the energy problems we have by promoting renewable energy sources. There's legislation authored by members of this committee to do just that. We know that works. We know that since the President extended the solar tax credit on commercial and residential property, we've seen great benefits of that. We know that not only is it good energy policy and good for our environment, but it also creates a lot of jobs. Since the energy tax credits first took place in 2006, employment in U.S. solar industry has grown by a little less than 200,000 jobs in more than 8,000 solar companies. And we know that this has been good for the environment, that it's created enough clean solar energy nationwide to power some 8 million homes and offset 45 million metric tons of damaging carbon emissions. And Mr. Reed and I have legislation in this committee, a bill, H.R. 5167, the Technologies for Energy Security Act, to extend that renewable investment tax credit for non-solar technologies. The bill has 28 bipartisan co-sponsors, and I think it's something that if you were to bring it up, Mr. Chairman, we could get that thing passed out of this committee. It doesn't have the externalities associated with its passage that Mr. McDermott and others have talked about, and we have proof that these new technologies are working. They're working in every one of our districts. And it just seems to me that we're missing an opportunity and not bringing this bill up and advancing those tax credits. Good for the environment, good for jobs, good for the economy. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Dole, you're recognized. Strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do move to strike the last word, and I want to echo what my colleague from California said. You know, renewable energy, I certainly am in favor of renewable energy, and frankly, as we talk about innovation, how we're moving forward, I do think that this piece of legislation is a good bill, but I also want to make sure that we're not turning our back on nuclear energy, and understand that certainly in Illinois we have a number of nuclear power facilities. that need some assistance, some help as we look forward. We do, as Dr. McDermott was talking about, spent nuclear fuel rods. I have spent nuclear fuel rods that reside just a few hundred yards from the greatest freshwater supply we have in our nation in the Great Lakes. And honestly, I do believe that if we need to be focusing on what we can be doing for our existing nuclear power facilities so that they don't become obsolete, so that we don't have more spent nuclear fuel that is lying around our country. And so I just wanted to put my 2 cents in to ensure that we are not allowing our older plants to become obsolete. Nuclear energy has been a safe and efficient source of energy for our country, and we should not continue, I believe, to invest in this valuable source of energy, and I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Doles. Anyone else? Mr. Doggett, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to join in expressing the concerns voiced by Mr. Thompson and Dr. McDermott. I think the real problem with nuclear power is that it does better in a socialist economy than a capitalist one, because nuclear energy prefers to have the public do the cleanup, do the insurance, cover all of the losses, and it only wants the profits. Friends of the Earth has suggested that this measure is simply a bailout for an inherently risky and uneconomical project. Traditionally, under utility law, only that plant and structure that is used and useful for the customer gets billed to the customer. That, of course, was changed in Georgia, and it's unfortunate that it has been, but as Friends of the Earth has suggested about this bill, it is, quote, simply a taxpayer bailout for these failed projects. Perhaps even worse, eliminating the placed in service date will provide an incentive for yet another company to make the same mistakes. I also share the concern Mr. Thompson has voiced that of all the many measures that we have pending in this Congress that might really be helpful in moving us to a renewable energy-based economy rather than an outdated system, that we picked this bill, this measure, as the one that will be considered rather than looking at solar, wind, and other measures for energy conservation and for renewable energy. So it is not just the waste, though that is a major issue. Many people wanting to dump this waste in Texas, Dr. McDermott, if not in Washington. And it is the risk to the taxpayer, to the ratepayer. I see no reason to move forward with this piece of legislation when there are so many other worthy measures out there that should be approved. And I urge a rejection of the measure.
Thank you. Does anyone else wish to strike the last word? I might make a brief comment. I appreciate the leadership of Mr. Reed and Mr. Thompson on their measure and the vocal legislative support from Mr. Me and Mr. Pascrell and others on this. Temporary provisions have been considered throughout the year. We continue to listen to the supporters of this measure. We know they care about moving forward technologies from fuel cells to combined heat to power systems and wind turbines. We know this is an important part of our energy mix. So we'll continue to listen to the champions and work on this issue going forward through this session. So with that, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Mr. Pascrell.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Hold on one second. Mr. Pascrell, do you wish to be recognized to offer an amendment?
Yes.
I do.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Mr.
I
Wright.
reserve a point of order.
Reserve a point of order. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized to offer his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment. I'd like to offer an amendment to H.R. 5879. I agree with Mr. Rice and Mr. Blumenauer that we should do our part in promoting alternative sources of energy to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. I agree that nuclear is a part of that solution. And I guess if you don't agree with that, then you're not going to agree with what I have to say. My bill, H.R. 4088, the Promoting Offshore Wind Power Act, has bipartisan support My friend from New Jersey, Frank LoBionda, Congressman LoBionda, has worked on this with me for a few years, would provide a 30% tax credit on investment in offshore wind for the first 3,000 megawatts generated under Section 48 of the tax code. Offshore wind is unique because of the long investment time it takes to get them up and running. An investment tax credit based on megawatts rather than time, Mr. Chairman, rather than time, which is used now, would be a more efficient way to deliver a return on investment for offshore wind developers. The United States is far behind our competitors in using this technology. The first domestic offshore wind farm is almost ready to go off the coast of Rhode Island. But we need to step our commitment to make offshore wind investment a reality. Our bill is bipartisan, supported by members from 6 different states. I think it deserves consideration by this committee. I hope we can work to advance it before the year is up, and I will withdraw my amendment, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Without objection, the amendment is withdrawn. Are there any other amendments to the amendment in the nature of substitute? If there are no amendments, questions on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of substitute, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 5879 as amended to the House of Representatives.
Questions on favorably reporting
Mr.
the bill?
Chairman, on that, I'd ask for recorded vote at the appropriate time.
At the appropriate time. Questions on favorably reporting the bill H.R. 5879 as amended? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. A recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Great.
Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Nunez? Mr. Teaberry? Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Dr. Bustani? Dr. Bustani, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, aye. Dr. Price? Dr. Price, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith in Nebraska? Mr. Smith, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson?
Aye.
Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black? Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Young? Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Renacci? Mr. Meehan? Mr. Meehan, aye. Ms. Nome? Ms. Nome, aye. Mr. Holding?
Aye.
Mr. Holding, aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri? Aye. Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Dold? Mr. Dold, aye. Mr. Rice? Mr. Rice, aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Rangel? Mr. Rangel, no. Dr. McDermott? No. Dr. McDermott, no. Mr. Lewis? No. Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Neal? No. Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Becerra? Mr. Doggett? No. Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? No. Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? Yes. Mr. Larson, yes. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, aye. Mr. Kind? Aye. Mr. Kind, aye. Mr. Pascrell? Aye. Mr. Pascrell, aye. Mr. Crowley? Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Nunez? Mr. Teaberry? Ms. Black? Mr. Young? Mr. Renacci? Mr. Becerra? Mr. Crowley? Chairman Brady?
Aye.
Chairman Brady, aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
23 yeas, 9 nays.
On this vote, the ayes are 23 and the noes are 9. The motion is agreed to. H.R. 5879 as amended is ordered favorably reported. The House of Representatives without objection. I ask staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill, and the members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional dissenting, or minority views. Our next order of business is H.R. 5406, the Helping Ensure Accountability, Leadership, and Trust in Tribal Health Care Act. This time I'd like to recognize the bill's sponsor, Ms. Noem, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Great Plains region is home to over 120,000 Native Americans who rely on the Indian Health Service for their health care. The region, which includes my home state of South Dakota, is home to some of the most rural and economically distressed tribal communities in the country. They face unimaginable poverty, substance abuse, and epidemic stress, and rates of youth suicide are through the roof. Unfortunately, the IHS is a broken agency that is fundamentally incapable of helping tackle the most pressing health issues in Indian country. In 2010, before I came to Congress, then Senator Byron Dorgan conducted an investigation of the Great Plains region of IHS. He released a shocking report detailing serious financial problems, providers with expired licenses, employee theft of addictive pills by the thousands, and even babies being born on the floor of hospital bathrooms. Following the report, IHS never brought the kind of change that they promised. So last year, CMS terminated or threatened termination of its relationship with IHS hospitals in Nebraska and South Dakota for infractions ranging from failure to follow important basic procedures to washing surgical instruments by hand. After these deficiencies came to light, IHS abruptly closed the sole emergency room serving the Rosebud Sioux tribe. It was simply too dangerous to treat patients there. IHS diverted patients to hospitals located over 50 miles away. This closure continued for 7 months, and during that time, 9 people died in ambulances while in transit to those other hospitals. And just last week, IHS announced that it would temporarily close its location in Rapid City. It would be effective next Tuesday, and that now emergency patients would be sent across town to a private hospital, which will almost certainly be forced to absorb any extra cost. So we as members of Congress have tried to spend our way out of these problems. Congress increased the IHS budget almost every year since Senator Dorgan's report, exceeding the President's budget request twice. The IHS budget now sits at nearly $1 billion more than in 2010. Yet the problems are as serious as they've ever been. I believe that the IHS needs more funding, but money alone is simply not going to fix the problem. My Bipartisan Health Act contains sensible solutions like improving recruitment and retention of quality staff, eliminating barriers for voluntary medical and dental providers, and reforming critical funding formulas. Today, we consider a section of the Health Act that seeks tax parity between the IHS Student Loan Repayment Program and other similar programs. This provision is small in scope and cost, but it's critical because the IHS Student Loan Repayment Program is the agency's best recruitment tool for high-quality providers. This policy has been included in the President's budget request, and some of my Democratic colleagues have co-sponsored similar legislation this Congress. I urge my colleagues to support this provision. And finally, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this markup. And I also want to thank the committee's health and tax staff. They've been amazing. Alyssa, Lisa, Emily, Barbara, and John for their work as we've developed this response to the healthcare crisis that's going on in Indian country. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize Ranking Member Levin or his designee for an opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, let me just comment briefly. This bill has merit. I think there will not be any basic disagreement with it. At least I don't know of any. But what happened on the last vote, I want to comment on. Because it was a bill relating to energy. And there was discussion about so many other energy bills that have never really been taken up here. And some of our colleagues on the Republican side talked about the need to act on 48C. And Mr. Thompson outlined his bill, and there are pieces of it that everybody agrees with. But nothing has happened. The bills we proposed, you say you're considering, and this issue of 48C items, we continue to hear that at some point we'll work on them. At some point. It won't be this week. We're not sure we'll be here next week. So essentially what's being said is that we're going to take up certain bills like the nuclear bill that Mr. Blumenauer worked hard on. But there is no assurance that we're going to address the other issues, including those relating to renewables. So if we're going to have bipartisanship, there has to be more than a suggestion that we'll take them up at some point, especially since we're left with no indication of any action except perhaps at a lame duck session. And so that's the problem. And you can't build bipartisanship based on indications later. So I don't think we object to this bill. I hope there aren't too many categorical assertions regarding government services. But I do hope that the votes that we cast on the first bill will be taken seriously, including Mr. McDermott's substantive discussion, so that as we proceed, I guess when we come back and before that, we will sit down and work seriously on how we're going to extend the renewables that were left out inadvertently. It was pure inadvertence. But they're up hanging in suspension. I yield back.
Thank you. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 5406. That objection to the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. This time, an offer an amendment in the nature of substitute which was distributed in advance, along with the green sheet explaining it. That objection to the amendment in the nature of substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, considered base text for purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Tom Barthold, Chief of Staff for the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Barthold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The members of the committee have before you two joint committee documents, JCX 78 and 79, which describe H.R. 5406 and the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. By way of background, under present law, as a general matter, discharge of indebtedness is includable in income. But under a program of the National Health Service to encourage underserved areas, discharge of indebtedness for certain health professions is excluded from income. The legislation before you today would provide the same to a similar loan repayment program administered by the Indian Health Service, and the chairman's amendment, the nature of a substitute, conforms the health specialties covered by the Indian Health Service program for the purpose of discharge of indebtedness exclusion to those health specialties covered under the National Health Service Corp program. The legislation would be effective for calendar years after 2016. That concludes my brief description. I'd be happy to answer any detailed questions that the members might have.
Thank you. Are there any questions about the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Dr. McDermott.
I just have one question. Is the categories under the National Health Service Act are more than physicians? It's also nurses, nurse practitioners, so other categories of people delivering health care who have had their training.
That's correct, Mr. McDermott. It's more than just MDs or more than just dentists. It can include a dental hygienist. It can include nurse practitioner, as you noted, certified nurse midwife, a number of other medical professions. Physician's assistants is included under the National Health Service program.
Thank you. That's all I want.
Thank you. Are there any questions about the amendment and the nature of a substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Dr. Davis, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I would move to strike the last word. I supported H.R. 5406 and commend Representative Noem for its introduction. All of us know that the National Health Service Corps is one of the main programs and one of the main ways that we provide physicians and other personnel to what are called medically underserved and manpower shortage areas. Much of what we know as tribal areas fit this description and this criteria. And so I would certainly agree that the same treatment should apply to the Indian Health Service Scholarship and Loan Program as to the National Health Service Program. This legislation actually helps to correct an inequity that never should have existed. Again, I commend Representative Noem for its introduction and support its passage.
Thank you, Thank you, Dr. Davis. Dr. McDermott, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Lewis raised an interesting, and I guess Mr. It really has been an issue that we have considered bills, and it's very hard to figure out exactly why or how, if it's sponsorship or exactly what it is. Mr. Paulson and I have had a Housing for Homeless Students and Veterans Act, which is also in the Senate. Senator Franken, Mr. Portman, Patty Murray, Susan Collins, Angus King. The same bill is in the Senate. This is to allow the low-income housing tax credit to be used for homeless kids and for homeless veterans. And while I understand, we're dealing with Indians right here. We got a bill about Indians, and somebody could raise a point of order and say, well, this is out of order. But frankly, people who are in this situation, the homeless, whether they be Indian or not, have got a health problem. And I really don't understand why that bill did not get considered when you had this long list of bills. I think Mr. Paulson's a fine Republican. He and I have been working on this bill together, and I don't see how you made the choice to leave that bill off the list. So I simply raised the question. I'm going to vote for this bill because it's necessary. It's a good piece of legislation, but there's so many other groups who have got similar problems that we ought to be taking care of. Yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Does anyone else wish to strike the last word? Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of substitute? If there are no amendments, questions on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of substitute, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Any chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 5406 as amended to the House of Representatives.
Questions on favorably reporting the bill H.R. 5406 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Being the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 5406 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, I ask the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. The members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk's supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. Our next order of business is H.R. 5204, the Stop Taxing Death and Disability Act. This time I'd like to recognize the bill's sponsor, Mr. Roscom, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Brady, and I want to thank Mr. Kind for working with me on this bill as my partner and co-sponsor on this. This is one of these situations where you hear about it and you almost can't even believe it's true. And so let me describe for you a little bit of the backstory. Under current law, if a student, including a veteran, becomes permanently and totally disabled or passes away, their federal student loans, and those loans borrowed or co-signed by a parent, are forgiven. So far, so good. That's the part that you can feel good about. The part that you can't feel good about is this is considered income, and the Internal Revenue Service sends you a bill. This is the least that the government can do. That is forgiving these loans. So while families are either planning a funeral or adjusting to the new life of a disabled child, the U.S. government comes knocking and demands tax payments on the total amount of the forgiven loan. An example of this comes from a Maine family where parents faced $24,000 in taxes on forgiven loans after their son died from a brain aneurysm. The Baltimore Sun reported that they're still paying over $400 a month to the government as a result. This is just plain wrong, and this committee can do something about it. H.R. 5204, the Stop Taxing Death and Disability Act, exempts from income tax federal and private student loans discharged due to the death of a borrower or their total and permanent disability. While we can't stop these unspeakable tragedies from happening, obviously, the very least we can do is ensure that the federal government isn't making it worse by making it a taxable event. This bill has strong bipartisan, bicameral support and has been endorsed by more than 20 groups, including the American Legion, the Military Officers Association of America, American Foundation for the Blind, and the Education Finance Council. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize Ranking Member Levin or his designee for an opening statement.
Thank you. I yield to Mr. Kind.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As Mr. Roscom pointed out, this legislation would merely exclude from income tax liability the discharge of student debt due to death or permanent disability of that student. We know of no opposition to this legislation. I commend Mr. Roscom for the leadership and the work that he's put into this legislation. It is the right thing to do, because when a student takes out a student loan, I think the implicit, if not explicit consideration, to use a contract term, is that that student would then go on and get a decent education, develop some life skills so that they can get a meaningful job and be in a position to be able to repay that student loan. But when you have an intervening event such as death or a permanent disability, it's impossible for the student to fulfill the terms of that agreement. So we think the fair thing to do then is just to exempt from income tax liability the discharge of the debt for that student or a cosigner of that law. And that's why I think this is so non-controversial. It's pretty de minimis as far as the overall cost over the next 10 years, and we would encourage our colleagues to support this legislation. I yield back.
Thank you. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 5204. Without objection, the measures will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. This time, I offer an amendment in the nature substitute, which was distributed in advance along with the green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in nature substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Tom Bartold, the Chief of Staff for the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after the presentation. Mr. Bartold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The members have before them 2 joint committee documents, JCX 80 and 81, which describe H.R. 5204 and the chairman's amendment. As I noted previously, present law generally provides that a discharge of indebtedness is income to the former borrower. Under present law, exceptions for discharge of indebtedness exist for certain student loans when the borrower works for a certain period of time in specified professions. What H.R. 5204 does is it broadens this exclusion to discharges of indebtedness pursuant to the death or the permanent disability of the borrower, and it also broadens eligible loans to include certain private education loans. The chairman's amendment, in the nature of a substitute, changes the effective date of this legislation to be effective for discharges after the close of calendar year 2016. That concludes my description of the bill. Be happy to answer any detailed questions that the members might have.
Thank you. Are there any questions about the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Dr. McDermott?
We've talked about student debt before, but if I understand it, a student who gets into a income-based repayment or income contingent repayment, they pay for a certain number of years, and then if they have not completely paid off the debt, it's discharged. Is that correct under present law?
That is one circumstance where that occurs, Mr. McDermott. There are other circumstances where a debt might be discharged. As an example, such as in the last legislation, if the debt were incurred to finance medical education and it was discharged essentially in return for someone promising to provide medical services in an underserved area, that would be excluded from income under present law also.
But
the case you described is one such case.
If somebody has paid for, if they paid for 10 years under an income-related plan, and they get discharged $30,000, $40,000 at the end of it, that does not become income?
It's a more limited circumstance than you were describing. If it's public service loan forgiveness, then the IRS has ruled that there's not discharge of indebtedness in income. If the person were engaged in a non-public service profession, then that discharge of indebtedness would be included in income, even under the income-based repayment program.
So the decision the student has to make is to go into public service to get that not become income at the end of the repayment period. If he goes into real estate or goes into farming or any one of a half a dozen things, goes to Washington State University and he does his payments and he gets to the point where he's still got some, but he's at the end of his period, it's then considered income.
As a general matter, that would be the case, Mr. McDermott, yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Are there any questions about the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Mr. Pasquale, you're recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to commend Mr. Kine, Mr. Roscom, for drafting the legislation. Families should not be hit with a tax bill when they're grieving the loss of a child, and certainly not on forgiven student loans. But I'd like to highlight, if I may, Mr. Chairman, just for a few moments, a similar bill that I put forward, the Christopher Brisky Student Loan Protection Act, which would prohibit private student loan lenders from taking any adverse action against a borrower upon a borrower or cosigner's death or disability. This happened in my district. With student loan debt outnumbering credit card debt in the United States, these pieces of legislation are the least we can do to reduce the huge financial strain families find themselves in simply for sending their kids to college. It's an unbelievable moment. The death of a child and assuming the money that he owes back. So I urge my colleagues supporting the bill today, which I think is a very good bill, to take a look at my bill, H.R. 3474, and join me in supporting grieving families. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Pasquarello. Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Oh, Dr. Davis, do you wish to strike the last word?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support H.R. 5204, and I commend Mr. Roscom and Mr. Kind for its introduction. In the near future, I hope the committee will expand the non-taxability of loan discharges to all student loan discharges, regardless of the reason for the discharge, to better help low-income families and to improve the consistency of the tax code. In particular, many low-income borrowers currently need to lower their monthly student loan payments via some form of income-driven repayments. This is a critical benefit to families in Illinois and across the nation to help them afford higher education. Some of these borrowers responsibly pay their bills for 20 to 25 years and qualify for loan discharge for the remainder of their loan. Unfortunately, most of these borrowers cannot afford this tax liability from the discharged debt. Further, I would hope the committee will consider my legislation to help the tax code work better with Pell Grants for the neediest students. Currently, an estimated 1 million low-income students do not benefit from the AOTC due to poor AOTC and Pell Grant coordination. This mainly affects low-income students at community colleges. My bill with Representative Black last Congress would fix this issue. So I support H.R. 5204 and hope that we improve higher education tax policy for even more families as we move forward. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yield back.
Thank you. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are no amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those no. Being the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 5204 as amended to the House of Representatives.
Questions on favorably reporting the bill H.R. 5204 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 5204 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, I ask the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. The members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional dissenting, or minority views. Our next order of business is H.R. 4220, the Water and Agricultural Tax Reform Act by Mr. Buck of Colorado. At this time, I'll recognize myself for purposes of an opening statement. H.R. 4220, the Water and Agricultural Tax Reform Act of 2016, is a common sense bill that will allow tax-exempt mutual ditch and irrigation companies to improve their infrastructure and provide water in arid locations more efficiently. In many rural areas, mutual ditch and irrigation companies are critical to the provision of water to farmers, ranchers, and water users. This legislation would allow these companies to sell water and water rights to non-members and use that revenue to improve the infrastructure for managing water delivery and storage. This will facilitate better access to water in rural areas and support rural economies. Ranking Member Levin has indicated that there will not be an opening statement. So the committee will proceed to consideration of H.R. 4220 without objection. The measure will be considered as read and open for amendment. At any point at this time, I offer an amendment in the nature of substitute, which was distributed in advance along with the green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, considered base text for purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Tom Bartold, the Chief of Staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Barthold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The members of the committee have before them two joint committee documents, JCX 82 and JCX 83, which describe HR 4220 and the chairman's amendment. Under present law, to be a tax-exempt mutual company, there's an 85% member income test for the sale of water. Basically, most sales have to be to members. The underlying legislation would relax the 85% member income test with respect to sale of water to non-members and for expenditures on investments to facilitate sales of water to non-members. The chairman's amendment, the nature of substitute, in addition to providing a short title to the legislation, fixes the effective date as income and expenditures incurred after 12/31/2016. That concludes my brief description. I'd be happy to answer any detailed questions that the members might have.
Thank you. Are there any questions about the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Mr. Thompson?
I could go either way, Mr. Chairman. Questions or striking the last word. What do you prefer?
We're going to move to striking the last word. I can recognize you right now.
Well, let me ask Mr. Brokaw a question. I've got folks in my part of California that I don't know if I should say they have concern about this, or they're just we haven't had a hearing on this. I know we had the author testified in Member Day, but we haven't really had a chance to have a hearing and hear from all interested parties. And I have a lot of folks in the rural part of our state are concerned with what this may lead to down the road. The chairman said it would help folks move water in rural areas. I don't think they're concerned about that, but what they are concerned about is that it moves water out of rural areas or moves water away from agriculture. And there just seems to me to be a lot of unknown on this. And without the benefit of a hearing, it's difficult to drill down and understand what the long-term implications of this would be. If it means a reduction in agricultural land, if it means a hit to and a reduction in farming, then I'm going to have big concerns with it. Mr. Burkhalter, can you give us any indication of what the externalities of this could be long-term?
Maybe a couple points, Mr. Thompson. The legislation basically leaves intact who's making the decisions. So if it's members that own the ditch, own the water rights, it's their decision in terms of sales. So it doesn't automatically foster sales away from agriculture, or it wouldn't seem to. What it does do.
I'm not suggesting that it would automatically do this, but would it provide any long-term incentive for moving water away from agriculture? Would it allow, I don't know, the money savings to be reinvested into infrastructure that would do that?
Well, it does permit sales to non-members for the purpose of meeting the 85% income test. So to the extent that the members, and let's say they were all in agriculture, decided that they wanted to sell some of their water to non-agricultural interests, it would mean that they would not violate the 85% income test. Were they to do that absent this legislation, that would create taxable income.
So there's a disincentive for doing that under existing law, but it would be somewhat incentivized if this were to come into play.
There's a disincentive to fail the 85% member use test, and this does relax that test.
Well, thank you. I just think that this is, an issue that's pretty volatile, and I think when it was said that whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting over, they were probably talking about a lot of our districts. And if this does in fact provide some sort of incentive in the out years to do anything that would harm farming, I'm going to have concerns with it. So I'm assuming you're going to voice vote it. I'm going to vote no.
Well, before you do that, may I clarify? In my discussions, if the gentleman will yield, my discussions with Representative Buck, this was introduced to try to make sure there's better access to water, which is critical to the survival of the agricultural businesses. And he and Senator Bennett, from my understanding, has introduced this to allow a way to create more revenue for that infrastructure, especially in arid areas, obviously.
Reclaiming my time, I don't doubt why they did it. My only concern is, without having a hearing and hearing from everybody, I don't know if there are things that we should be concerned about, as I stated. And I'm not just dreaming it up on the dais. This has been brought to my attention by a number of people, some of whom are in agriculture in my home state. And I'm just a little concerned that we're getting out in front of this without knowing what all of the externalities might be.
Let us do this as well. I know that's not the intent of the legislation.
I'll concede that.
Mr. Buck has a very strong agricultural district and interest would love to put you together with the author on this measure before it goes to the floor.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is anyone else? Are there any other questions on the amendment in nature substitute? Dr. McDermott? Striking the last word. Yes, sir.
I move to strike the last word. Mr. Thompson raises the most crucial issue about all these bills. This bill is sponsored by a whole bunch of people, none of whom are on this committee. The chairman has talked to them. That's nice, and I appreciate that, and I believe he has. But the fact is we've never had a hearing. And those of us from the West know about the problems with water. I don't care which western state you want to go into, whether it's Texas or Oklahoma or Arizona or New Mexico, you've had Utah, Idaho, Washington, Oregon, California, we all got problems. We live in a desert. And so when you make a change in the law without even having a hearing on it, I don't think the motives of anybody's being questioned here. As Mr. Thompson says, we know they think it's a good idea, but we ought to have a hearing and let everybody come in, because we wind up with things where we have people having sit-ins and facing down fisheries officials in Oregon and all kinds of things that happen around the issue of water. Is there water for fish? Is there water for agriculture? And all those issues get played into this. And when you make a change, even though it may be a small one, I guess, I don't know if it's small or big, actually. Maybe Mr. Thompson has a better idea than I do. But we absolutely need to have hearings on it. Now, we could talk about jobs and job tax credits. Mr. Reichert and I put in a bill, along with Mr. Reed and others, about using the job tax credit for homeless kids and helping them get the ability to use the income tax credit, but work tax credit with their problems. There are people who have got good bills in this committee who don't get heard, and we take a bill that has not been heard from some nice members of Congress who just come up here and talk to the chairman and say, hey, put my bill through, and here we are, boom, gone. That's not good legislation. And I share with Mr. Thompson the worry, and everybody who's from a western state ought to be worried. We all remember that Atlanta last year ran out of water, and they were down there fighting with Tennessee about whether they could have the water out of some of the rivers in Tennessee. And this issue in this country is a big issue, and a water bill shouldn't go through here without a single hearing. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Does anyone else wish to strike the last word? I would note that Representative Buck did testify at the congressional hearing, asking for members' ideas, made himself available for questioning. But in coming from Texas, a pretty strong water state ourselves, I too are sensitive to those issues and confident this bill actually achieves what it intends and says it does. So, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are no amendments, questions on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I recognize Mr. Johnson for the purposes of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that committee favorably report H.R. 4220 as amended to the House of Representatives.
Questions on favorably reporting the bill H.R. 4220 is amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 4220 is amended. It's ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, I ask the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. The members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. There being no further business before the committee stands adjourned.